those you care about, or of the consciousnesses of perfect strangers who you'll never meet. If you care about the difference between happiness and suffering in this universe, your own or your children's or strangers, as you are right to do, and really all of our morality and ethics is based on that kind of caring. What you're talking about is consciousness and its contents. You're talking about the character of experience for conscious beings. And so consciousness is the basis of all experience, and it does have a certain character that can be recognized. And its character is, in the Buddha sense, it is selflessness. It is another term which is profoundly misleading in English. It's often used in Buddhism is emptiness. Right? The Sanskrit is shunyata. Now, emptiness is a kind of a depressing term. I mean, people they tend not to want more of it. More of it when they hear about it. It's like, why would I want the punchline of spiritual life to be emptiness? Right? That just sounds like the most boring, depressing thing in the world. But it's not certainly not meant to be, and it's not when you see its implications. I mean, it has implications of freedom and lack of contrivance and lack of its centerlessness, and it's unconstrained. It's unborn is another word that comes up in Buddhism. Uncontaminated, and it's not constructed of anything. It's not built on anything. It's not predicated. It's not contingent. It doesn't require any specific contents of consciousness to be real, right? It's the prior reality of the fact that anything is happening at all, subjectively speaking. And when you recognize that reality and you recognize that you are identical to it as a matter of experience, there is real freedom even in the midst of classically negative experience, even in the midst of physical pain, even in the midst of profoundly negative thoughts. Profoundly negative thoughts recognized are like, very ugly images, on a movie screen. They just don't hurt the screen, right? Or very ugly things, held up in front of a mirror. The mirror doesn't contract. The mirror doesn't recoil from ugly images, right? The mirror is just this condition in which anything can kind of effortlessly appear. And consciousness can be recognized to be that way. And so from the Buddha side, just linguistically, they tend to emphasize what it's not. It's not a self. It's not compounded. It's not conditional. It's not constructed. And so there's just this sort of this negative effort of sort of disavowing any assumption about what it is, right? And not reifying it, not making something of it. Whereas on the Advaita side, coming from an Indian tradition that is just filled to bursting with sort of positive assertions of religiosity, and just the kind of the Hindu context in which Advaita Vedanta is the ultimate expression of wisdom. There's just a lot of assertion about spiritual reality and a lot of metaphysics. So Buddhism traditionally is a reaction against all of that, and it tends to maintain this reaction even against some of the language that is used in Advaita. The main indiscretion being, capital S self, right? Like the punchline for Advaita is, you are the self. You're not the little self. You're the big self. But I'm convinced that they're talking about the same experience. Ultimately, they're just asserting different things about it. And here we're up against the limitations of language. I think there's a danger with both ways of talking about it. I mean, in the Buddhist framing, the danger is it becomes so dry and analytical that people get the wrong idea. They think that there's something kind of life-canceling about this whole project, right? This is like, it's no self. Nirvana is the extinguishing of suffering, but it's the kind of the extinguishing of everything else. You're losing your identity. Life is this is often it's a very current mistranslation, but most people think the Buddha said life is suffering, right? Like it's all suffering. There's no happiness, right? That's not what the Pali term dukkha means, but it includes suffering. But the basic meaning is unsatisfactoriness, very much because of what I just said about the implications of impermanence, right? Like, because everything is changing, there's nothing you can successfully hold on to. That is unsatisfactory. If you're seeking a permanent state of satisfaction, you're not going to find it here because everything is changing, right? And you, amid that change, if you think your happiness depends on gratifying desire, getting the next thing you want, you are engaged by definition in a ceaseless search for gratification. I mean, you have to keep building the house anew every day, right? Because it's all, the walls are always falling down, right? There's just a continuous project of maintenance, and that's true of our world. I mean, we're continually maintaining the kind of the material requisites of our well-being, but the question is, what are we doing with our attention moment by moment while we do that? And once you learn to meditate, you can recognize that it's actually possible to be happy before the next good thing happens, right? Before you solve the problem that has just appeared. So before you got rid of the next negative thing that has happened, right? So you have a pain and you have to figure out, okay, now what am I going to do about it? Well, do I have to call a doctor? Okay, this is bad enough. It's not going away. I don't know what it is. I'm going to call a doctor, right? At each stage along the way, there's an opportunity to either be at rest and just simply do the next thing from the point of view of already being okay, psychologically and spiritually, contemplatively, or you can be thrust into this dreamscape of one anxious thought following the next, thinking about the past and future, and feeling at each moment along the way that your well-being is entirely dependent on resolving this situation, right? Like you're not going to be okay until this pain is gone, until you have figured out what it is, you've seen the necessary doctor, and now it's gone, right? It's no possibility of being okay until you have solved that problem. And so it is with desire. Like, you have now figured out the next thing you want. You're not going to be okay until you get that thing, right? Because the feeling of desire itself is a kind of discomfort, right? Like you recognize that, okay, you've got a problem. You've got a problem in your life that can only be filled by a certain shaped object, right? And until you figure out how to get united with that object, whether it's a relationship or a change in your business or a change in your health or an understanding of what's happening in the world, you're living with a mental state in the presence of which you're sufficiently uncomfortable that you have to rearrange the world so as to get rid of that state. Meditation allows you to recognize that consciousness is already free and open and without center, even in the presence of that mental state. And the thought you were just thinking that delivered that state itself was just an appearance that was happening all by itself. And you break the spell and you recognize, okay, now you're at rest. It's not to say that there's nothing that needs to be done. You might still have a pain that you should go to a doctor for. You might still have a business problem you need to solve, but you can do it from a state of being that recognizes we're all going to die, right? Like your well-being can't be predicated. I mean, winning this game can't be a matter of not dying. It can't be a matter of not having pains. It can't be a matter of not having business problems that you have to solve, right? Like it's like you're playing a video game where there are various boss fights and there are various challenges, and at every level it's interesting and complicated, and there's always something new appearing. I mean, what did you expect? Were you expecting a video game where nothing new appeared? Like you're expecting a place in the game where it's just smooth sailing without any impediment, and you just get to stay there, right? Like it's just that's just not the game we're in.
What a boring game.
Yeah, it would be boring, and it's the truth is there are kind of meditative equivalents of that where you can get. The truth is, you can become a monk or a nun, right? You can become a monastic where all you do every hour of the day is meditate, And so you have no business problems, you have no relationship problems, you have no kids, you have no, you have health problems, but you've limited the things that are on the menu to worry about. You're not going to be political. You're not going to worry about what's happening, in the news. You're not. You have absented yourself from any conversation that requires you to add your voice to the complications of the world. And now you're just going to pay attention to the contents of consciousness and meditate. There's a way to, I'm not criticizing that project. I mean, I spent a fair amount of time on silent meditation retreats doing just that. So it was, I know what that life is like, at least for increments as long as 3 months at a time. But it's possible to engage all of that very much like trying to smooth out the video game to the point where it is boring but ecstatic, right? I mean, it's not really boring, because boredom as a state is really just our failure to pay attention to, like, the ordinary state of boredom that most people are familiar with is just nothing interesting or good enough is happening to capture your attention, and you don't know how to meditate, so you're waiting for something good to happen to capture your attention. You're scrolling for something that's going to give you a hit, of dopamine, or you're changing the channels, looking for something that you can disappear into, because you're uncomfortable enough in your own skin. You can't just stare at a wall and be happy. Whereas when you know how to meditate, you actually can't just stare at a wall and be happy. There's just the mystery of your own being there, just as available when you're looking at a wall. So a monk or a nun, they won't have that problem. But what they can have is the availability of a very different project, which is, universally condemned in contemplative circles as a kind of error, but it's a very pleasurable and arcane error, which is to become a kind of junkie of concentration, where the concentrated mind is incredibly pleasurable. Right? It's just, and you can be explicitly concentrated in states of mind like loving kindness, where you're just overwhelmed by feelings of love and compassion for all sentient beings, right? And you can just be sort of cruising in that stream for as long as you maintain that practice. So you could just be blissed out on meditation. And, it's not that it's a bad thing. It's not that it's necessarily a misuse of a person's life. I mean, because if that person is functioning in the world at all and meeting other people or teaching meditation to people, that can be one of the most inspiring people you're ever going to meet. I mean, you meet someone who's doing nothing but meditate on loving kindness, it's just, you can get just blissed out just hanging out with that person, because all they're thinking is how much they love you and how much they want you to be well, and they're not thinking about their career, they're not thinking about their relationship, they're not thinking about anything, and other than they're just pushing their good vibes out to the universe,
and that's real. That's felt.
That's very real, and they're very stoned. I mean, they're in a very good way.
High on their own supply.
Yeah, but there are two things wrong with this. One is it's also impermanent, right? It is, those high states of concentration are based on this very contingent effort to pay attention to a very specific thing to the exclusion of everything else, right? You're not available to everything else. You are meditating on something very specific. And you can fail to recognize that the real freedom of emptiness, the real freedom of non-duality, the real freedom of selflessness is just as available in ordinary states of consciousness as it is in this very rarefied state of just unconditional love for all sentient beings, right? So the ultimate wisdom of meditation, and again, both in the Buddhist tradition and in the Indian Advaitic one, is to recognize what consciousness is like, always and already coincident with every possible experience, not just the classically spiritual states of mind.
So that experience of freedom that you beautifully shared in both the Advaita Vedanta approach and Buddhist approach of emptiness, once you experience, once you feel and you taste that, it's like, oftentimes there can be kind of this evangelical fervor of wanting to share that because it's so good. It's like you found the biggest pot of gold at the end of the rainbow and you want to share that. One of the pitfalls on the path and the irony of the spiritual process, right, is that putting freedom off, like if you're going to take up the project of being spiritual, going on the spiritual path, walking that life, doing those practices, the very idea or thought of putting enlightenment into the future admits to yourself of your own unenlightenment in this present moment. And so the idea of putting freedom into some future state denies yourself of its possible realization that's already available to you. So I'd love for you to share a little bit more about this kind of dichotomy and how we can still feel the immense benefits from meditation and realize that it's a worthwhile practice to take up and to develop mindfulness within our reality, but to go on this path as sort of an initiate to some goal in the future is also to deny yourself the possible reality.
Yeah, no, that's a difficult question to resolve. Because on one level, it's true in the beginning, or at least seems to be true enough so as to be everyone's default starting point. I mean, in the beginning, you recognize that you have a problem, right? You're not as happy as you want to be. You suffer unnecessarily. Your attention is continually bound up in thought. You feel like a self. You don't know what the hell I'm talking about when I say the self is an illusion, right? I mean, like you're stuck. But you become sufficiently, let's say through a drug experience or through some peak experience that just comes over you for whatever reason. You get a glimpse of a different way of being, and you become absolutely convinced that there is a there there. There's not just a matter of religious belief or some new age fraudulence, right? Like you don't have to believe. It's not that you've taken on a new set of ideas. You've had a taste of something where you recognize, okay, it's possible to have a very different experience. Consciousness can be different than it's tending to be in my case. So how do I get there? Right, I have to recognize I'm not having that experience on a daily basis, and that is felt as a problem because I'm seeking to be happy, and I'm just not as happy as I could be, and I'm just gratifying one desire after the next, and yet there's this way of being that I know is possible. How to get there? So there is this duality of path and goal already set up, and it seems unavoidable. And when you're given a technique like mindfulness, again, start at that starting point, which is virtually everyone's starting point, you can't help but engage it dualistically, where you're just now you're trying to meditate. You recognize that distraction in thought is the problem. It's not that thought itself is the problem. You're not trying to suppress thought, but you are trying to recognize thought as thought, and you're finding that difficult because thoughts sneak up on you, and all of a sudden you're dreaming about lunch, and you forgot that you were trying to meditate, right? You were trying to follow the breath. You're following in and out and in and out, and then I wonder what's going to be for lunch, and you didn't see that happen. You didn't feel that happen. It just became you, and for a moment there, the whole project of meditation seemed to be interrupted by the dream about lunch. So it's within that's the frame in which you're now engaging this spiritual path, and it is dualistic. You're lost and found, right? You're meditating, and then you're not meditating, and then you're coming back to meditating. And even when you're being mindful, the experience of being mindful is, they're really, in my framing, there are really two stages to the path of mindfulness. There's the dualistic starting stage, which can last for a very long time, and then there's the non-dual stage where you can actually locate freedom and selflessness directly and become mindful of that, right? And so it's the dualistic stage I'm now describing, which where the problem you just posed is just very captivating for people. It's like, I can't pretend that I'm at the top of the mountain because I'm at the bottom of the mountain and I see the path, disappearing into the mist up there, and I'm trying to walk it, and yet I'm being told by everyone who's teaching this technique that it's not that the ego is real and that you meditate it out of existence. It's not that you actually polish a brick into a mirror. It's not that you There's nothing to really accomplish. You just have to pay sufficient attention to recognize that. It's the paying sufficient attention part that can seem laborious and can seem like you're doing something, and it's almost by definition gradual because it doesn't appear to be here now. But the truth is, it's actually not. There's an illusion here that just has to be penetrated, and when that happens for anyone is just a matter of luck on some level. It's not that you can't do things that are valuable to sort of orient toward it, and the practice of meditation is the most valuable thing I think anyone can do to become available to this insight. But when you have this insight into selflessness or into non-duality or emptiness, depending on how you want to talk about it, one of its hallmarks is you recognize, okay, that this was always already the situation, right? This is not something newly created by my meditative efforts. This is, there are many analogies. No analogy is great, but these are various analogies that I've used. One is that, have you ever been you go into a restaurant or a store, and there's a full-length mirror along one wall, like floor-to-ceiling mirror, and you might have let's say it's a restaurant, you might be halfway through your meal before you recognize that everyone over there on that side of the room is just in the same people you're sitting with, but they're in a mirror, right? So like the restaurant is like half the size you thought it was, right? That sudden phase transition is psychologically and perceptually interesting because nothing has actually changed about the visual experience, right? Like the light and the color and the shadow is all the same, but you suddenly have this new understanding of what is real, right? And you can make one way to sharpen that up is like, let's say the mirror is such that it's really just not clear, even if someone told you that over there, that's not the world, that's a mirror, right? You're being confused by your eyes. But you could imagine a mirror, sufficient, set up, in an artful enough way and reflecting just, the right part of the world, such that would not even be obvious, even if you were staring straight at it and given the instruction. No, you just have to look at it closely enough. You'll see there's no depth to that circumstance. There's just this. You're looking at light on a wall. You're not looking at people and events and beautiful and ugly, and nothing's happening over there, right? You're confused. But imagine what would happen if let's say a teacher, a Dzogchen master, a Zen master, somebody who could actually get through to you on this topic. They walk over to the mirror and they just put their hand right on it. They just wrap their knuckles on the glass. And all of a sudden, given that stimulus, you might say, oh, okay, now I see it, right? But nothing has really changed, right? It's like it was there, you were looking at it the whole time, and yet now you have this conclusive understanding of what is what. An analogous thing happens with mindfulness, where you are paying attention to thoughts and sensations and emotions, and you're getting lost in thought and coming back to the breath and coming back to the feeling of walking or whatever the object of mindfulness is at the moment. At a certain point, the sense that there is a meditator, the sense that there's a center to this experience, the sense that there's a thinker in addition to the flow of thought, the sense that there's a place from which you can aim attention to be meditating on anything, all of that just disappears, right? Like the center drops out and you discover your own absence in a very conclusive sense. And then that becomes the thing you can be mindful of, right? And then there are a few paths of practice that teach this very explicitly and target it in a very precise way. And the one that was most useful to me came from the Tibetan tradition. It's called the Dzogchen teachings. Also, Mahamudra within the Tibetan tradition does this. There are certain variants of Zen that kind of hit this point in a precise way, although, I would argue with less precision. I mean, you can spend a lot more time in the Zen tradition, to my eye, wondering whether you're doing it right. Whereas in a Dzogchen context, it's just you're not doing it right, and then you know you're doing it right. Like it's much more precise. In the Advaita tradition, the same is true. It's, again, differences in emphasis begin to matter. Like, you can spend a lot of time in an Advaita context, depending on the teacher, just talking about all this stuff and feeling that there is no methodology beyond just talking about it. Because with Advaita, you tend to get such an uncompromising criticism of every dualistic method that, Advaita is so alert to the problem you posed, which is the sense that I'm far away from the goal, right? Like, even conceiving of enlightenment proves to me that I'm not enlightened, right? Because what I'm left to be aware of is, in some sense, the evidence of my unenlightenment. That's what I'm mindful of. I'm mindful of the fact that a moment ago I was lost in thought, and now I'm trying to pay attention to the breath so as to not do that again. Right? Like, it's just me here meditating, right? But in Advaita, people will have heard of people like Ramana Maharshi or Nisargadatta Maharaj or Punjaji, who I studied with, who was a disciple of Ramana Maharshi, or Ramesh Balsekar, who was a disciple of Nisargadatta. These are a couple of modern teachers, but there are many others. The emphasis on the illusoriness of duality, the fact that there is no path, there is no goal, there's no one to accomplish it, it's always already the case, that becomes so, that path is so steep that for many people it's just like a brick wall. You just kind of slam into it and you're left with somebody saying, effectively, like, either you're going to understand what I'm saying right now, before I get to the end of the sentence, or it's hopeless. like it's just,
Yeah.
There's no one to do it, there's no one to try, consciousness is already free of self, and you either recognize that right now, or you're going to leave this room telling yourself a story that you have to meditate and you have to be a spiritual seeker, and that's all part of the bad dream that you haven't woken up from. So either you wake up now or not, right? And that is the methodology that Advaita implements again and again and again ad nauseum. And that's why you have people who spend, they can spend years just hanging out with their favorite guru, just talking the talk of Advaita, and maybe not recognizing this thing, right? Or maybe having peak experiences, which they then remember as, the moment where they glimpsed it, but they can't find it again in their moment-to-moment paying attention to experience. So what I think, the sweet spot for me, and again, it's not that there aren't pitfalls, in various moments depending on how you talk about it, but the sweet spot is to acknowledge the illusoriness of this, to acknowledge that consciousness is already this way, but to recognize that there is a precision required and an honesty, like an intellectual honesty required, and just like, what is it that you can notice now, right? What is available to attention now? And it in my experience, it requires a certain amount of training in mindfulness to actually be rigorously honest about what experience is like now.
To validate it within your own experience versus it's just like an intellectual thing, right?
Yeah, and also, or just a pretense. I've met people who spent a lot of time with Punjaji. Punjaji was kind of a unique case because he was this amazingly charismatic teacher. He was just this, to all appearances, just this wonderfully free being, right? And he certainly claimed to be enlightened. He was not hiding his light under a bushel. He claimed to be the real deal, and he seemed like the real deal. And he was totally uncompromising in in the non-duality of his non-duality, right? He would not, more so than his teacher, Ramana Maharshi. Ramana would say things like, "You must make every effort to become effortless," right? Like he would play with the duality, non-duality component of it, and acknowledge that for many people, even for him in certain cases, there was a path-like precursor to his being stably aware of this truth he was talking about. But Punjaji tended not to acknowledge any validity to anything path-like, right? So if you'd say, so he would just, his analogy for what meditation was, like you've come to him with 20 kilograms of bricks on your head, and you're complaining of how uncomfortable you are, and what every tradition of meditation does is just add more bricks to the pile. Like, here, we got a brick made of jade. We're going to put that on here to see if you feel better, right? And so it's completely ill-conceived. The logic is just backwards. There's nothing you're going to pay attention to now strategically as a spiritual practice that is going to be any use at all in this project, because the effort you are making is predicated on a false assumption. Everything about it, the beliefs, the affectations, the changes in your identity, the wearing of beads, your interest in certain books versus other books, the whole project is just an adumbration of your of the very thing that's making you unhappy, right? It's like your problem is seeking, and you can't seek your way out of it, right? And so emphasizing that to the exclusion of every other message leaves a lot of people feeling like, okay, that door is closed, right? I'm not going to become a Buddhist. I'm not going to become a meditator. I'm going to get rid of my beads. I'm not going to have any spiritual identity. It's all of that's a waste of time. And now I'm just here considering the project anew. And what happened two things happened to many people with Punjaji. One is there are many people who claim to be enlightened who obviously weren't, right? Like they had some brief moment with him, and then they went away and set up shop as gurus, and they were just it worked for some people and it didn't work for others, but it was just they had a belief about themselves that they're now these realized beings. Again, it was a new self-concept, right? And in some cases it was not that it was totally unwarranted. I mean, they were having very compelling spiritual experiences. They were very meditative people. They spent a lot of time on this project, and they got to Punjaji, and he basically deputized them as gurus, but which he did to everyone. I mean, literally anyone who would say anything positive in his presence, he would basically just say, you're going to do great work in America, right? And if you were the kind of person who wanted to set up shop as a guru, you could take the ball and run with it. So either that happened, or people just felt that all spiritual efforts were doomed, but then they just went on to live ordinary lives where they're making all kinds of other efforts to be happy, all the ordinary ones, to just figure out how to be have good relationships, and not be addicted to alcohol, and they're just trying to solve all the ordinary problems that everyone's trying to solve, trying to feel good, and yet they now know that meditation is bullshit, right? It's like that. So that they were left in a worse place on some level, right? I mean, it's almost like being told, at bottom you really are, an Olympic level athlete, right? Like you are, like if you could only just sit properly, like just get into the right posture, you'd recognize that you're Usain Bolt, right? You're like, you're as fast as any man who's ever run the 100-meter dash, right? And now you have this belief about yourself, but you just can't quite. I mean, and you might be trying to pretend to be a great athlete, but you can't actually function that way, or you have this belief that it's working out is hopeless, dieting's hopeless, getting in shape is hopeless, and you hope someday you're going to be fit, right? It's like it's just the door to the Dharma gets closed, and there's no alternative. So, and this is actually some clue as to why within the Dzogchen tradition they're very concerned that you not give the non-dual teachings out without a proper context, because people can get the wrong idea. And honestly, I mean, I walk that line however I do over at Waking Up, and it's not, I'm not sure I always walk it correctly in every instance. My feeling is you want to be rigorously honest about what is actually true for you in each moment, what seems to be true for you in each moment. You need a certain amount of mindfulness to do that. I think people should be disabused of all kinds of spiritual and religious illusions that You don't have to take anything on faith to engage this project. But I do think it's important at the soonest possible opportunity to be told that actually you can realize something truly fundamental and life-changing very soon. And it is, the hallmark of it is that it's always available. It's not something that you have to, get a lot of momentum behind you to get in, to get back to, right? It's not a peak experience that by definition will require a week of silence on retreat to get back to, or another tab of acid to get back to. And it's like, it is coincident with this moment, however ordinary it seems.
And it could be arrived at by as simple as this one deep breath, and you're back in that state, right, that you can experience. I think it's so valuable to have teachers and individuals that can point out and slap their hand on the mirror and point out things and help guide your attention to the nature of reality in a more true sense. Yet there's also, and you kind of touched on it a little bit, which I want to dive a little bit deeper here, is that it is possible to wake up beyond the illusion of self and still not have grown up beyond your own characterological defects. You can have a profound disidentification with your own thought and yet still act like an asshole or worse. And we've seen many cases of this, right?
Yeah.
And so I would love to dive into this a little bit more, because it's one half of the pie, right? Or potentially less, but to just pursue the disidentification with thought and this path of waking up without realizing that your characterological defects and essentially shadow material that you have not worked through will have a profound impact on people in your relationships and the outer world if you don't resolve as well.
Yeah, and also just differences in culture, right? Like becoming enlightened doesn't get you a new culture. It's like, and if you don't know anything about quantum mechanics before you become a Buddha, you're not going to know anything about quantum mechanics after you become a Buddha. I mean, leaving aside what people believe about the powers of a Buddha. And there's just the fact that there can be quite a distance in time between having genuine insight in what I'm talking about here, selflessness or non-duality, and truly stabilizing that insight so that you never overlook it again, right? So, I mean, for me, I make no pretense of being fully enlightened or a Buddha or like at the end of this project, right? Like I try to be rigorously honest about just what I can authenticate as a matter of my direct experience, what is plausible to me to believe in on the basis of what I know or think I know, and what it's pretty clear to me I'm not experiencing or haven't experienced. And so, I still definitely get lost in thought, right? The dream reasserts itself. Now, what it's like to wake up from the dream is different than it's different than it would be if I were practicing dualistically, right? Like when you're practicing mindfulness dualistically, you get lost in thought and you notice it. And then let's say you come back, let's say you're meditating on the breath, you come back to the breath, that there's still a lot of power in that. I mean, just learning to exercise this particular muscle of just getting distracted and then recognizing it and then no longer being distracted, coming back to the breath or coming back to sounds or anything you can notice. Even dualistically, that allows you to unhook from the emotional and behavioral implications of any one of those thoughts, right? So if it's a thought of anger and you notice it, and then you come back to just breathing, that gives you a degree of freedom that most people don't have. I mean, most people are just angry from that moment on, and they're just going to say or do whatever they do on that basis. They see no alternative but to feel identical to their thoughts. But if you're doing this dualistically, it seems like the sense of self is maintained throughout that whole process. Like, I feel angry, and then, I'm supposed to be meditating. Why did okay, back to the breath. But the meditator has been preserved. Like it's still me in here meditating, making an effort. Once you have really broken the spell and can practice in a non-dual way, the moment you notice the thought, the moment you notice you've become angry and the dreamscape of thought has captured you, not only does the thought just unravel the way all thoughts do? I mean, it's amazing that thoughts do anything at all to push us around, because I mean, when you actually look at them, these just the most gossamer, bits of language or imagery. I mean, there's nothing there really. So the thoughts unravel whether you're looking at them dualistically or not, or non-dualistically. But the moment you recognize a thought as a thought, coincident with that recognition, you notice there's no one recognizing it. I mean, there's no center to consciousness. It's just consciousness and its contents. And there's freedom in that, right? So you're not left with the problem of, okay, I better get the fuck back to the breath because this is a long project, right? Like I've been on this retreat for a week and this is still happening. I'm getting angry. What is like? Oh, now I'm thinking again. What the like that? So like it's that iteration just is perpetually feels like a problem that proves you're unenlightened and far from your goal, as you put it at the outset, right? And yet, when you can practice non-dualistically, you recognize that the goal is already here. You can in Dzogchen terminology, you can take the goal as the path. Like your next moment of path is enjoying the freedom of non-duality in that moment. It maybe only for a moment, right? So the crucial point here, though, is that even if you're practicing non-dualistically, you're still unless you're some adept or prodigy who, the moment you break through for the first time, you're done. You're stable for the rest of your life. You're still going to be fluctuating between enjoying consciousness as it is without distraction and being lost in the dreamscape of thought, right? And because you're still going to be caught by thought, it matters what kinds of thoughts you have, right? Because you're going to be doing something on the basis of those thoughts. You're going to be saying something. You're going to be captivated by something. You're going to be wanting something. And if you're a guru who really wants to have sex with his prettiest students, that's who you're going to be, right? Like you could be punctuating that with genuine insights into non-duality. But if you don't have an ethic, if you've come from a culture where that's actually not even a bad thing, like that's just tantra, right? You're just, of course you could have sex with anyone you want. You're the guru, right? You're like that. If you come from a theocracy and there's no HR department who's going to say, hey, listen, actually it's not a great thing to be. I mean, some of these students are married. There's a power differential here. Like there's a lot of projection going on. This is unfair. This is ethically unwise. This is you're actually, and in each one of those moments, you're being a selfish asshole and you're not recognizing it because you don't have that much mindfulness. You're not going to see the problem, and yes, we have lived with the consequences of that in many spiritual communities. Many gurus who were not actually frauds in the normal sense have behaved terribly with their students because they became rock stars in a very isolated community and gratified their desires, their still extant desires on that basis, right? I mean, just think of how tempting it is to be. I mean, basically, you're like you're John Bon Jovi, but you're on an island of people who are projecting all of their spiritual hopes and fears onto you, right? It's like you're a rock star with power, right? It's ridiculous, and most egos in that situation don't handle it very well, right? So it's not especially mysterious that spiritual teachers misbehave. And it's also not mysterious that even people with genuine spiritual insights can misbehave in those ways because they're getting lost in thought much of the time because they're not fully done with this process of recognizing the nature of consciousness. And as to whether anyone actually, I'm not sure I've met anyone who's totally fulfilled the process. I've certainly met people who have claimed to have done so, but and I've met people who I felt were further along than I was, and were very inspiring to me on that basis. But no, I think it's important to recognize that on some level, spiritual insight and even non-duality isn't enough to get us everything we want and are right to want in this world. I mean, it's not enough, a bunch of enlightened Buddhas even is not enough to help us build a civilization that really works, right? There's just a tremendous amount of knowledge that we want that you don't get by just meditating more, even correctly on the nature of emptiness. I mean, you don't spontaneously understand how to improve an economy, right? Or a medical system, or to engineer airplanes so that they crash less and less and less and ultimately don't crash at all, right? It's like that's all a matter of very specific forms of iterative knowledge acquisition that perfectly unenlightened people are qualified to do, right? It's like this is the whole project. These projects are orthogonal to one another. We want good aircraft engineers and we want Buddhas, and occasionally you might want, if you're an aircraft engineer, it might be nice to be a Buddha. If you're a Buddha, you probably don't care about being an aircraft engineer, but we need both, and they are different projects. And the crucial piece for your question with respect to the ethics is ethics has a lot in common with aircraft engineering, and is not fully captured by the project of just recognizing the self as an illusion, right? Because especially in this interval of where you're still just working out the consequences for yourself of this insight, right? And you're not fully stable, because if you're not fully stable, all you have are ideas and thoughts and culture with which to manifest. And if you have a culture that just hasn't figured out certain core ethical principles, as many cultures haven't, it's like when Punjaji had to get had to find his niece a husband, in India, he had no brighter idea about how to go about doing that than to take out, a classified ad with her picture in it, strategically lightened to make her look more light-skinned than she was, because that's valuable in Indian culture, right? Racism is the wrong concept, I guess, but there's some version of bias, prejudice against dark skin, even within Indian culture, that's a completely rational marketing tool for his niece, to find a husband. This is what the Buddha's, the self-proclaimed enlightened adept is doing to get to find a husband for his niece. Okay, is that the optimal way to solve this social problem of how do you get young people together to have satisfying marriages? I doubt it, right? It's like so he didn't have, by virtue of being the most blissed out and wise and compassionate person I had ever met at that point, he had exactly zero insight into how to solve this kind of social problem. There's just more. You need more than just the deliverance of your own personal freedom.
Powerful. I think it's such an important understanding and framework for people just to tap into a little bit here as well, because they are